This is Route 11 as it winds its way through downtown Franklin, New Hampshire. It's a road well traveled these days by presidential candidates hoping to do well in the first-in-the-nation New Hampshire primary next February. Good day and welcome to this week's edition of Road to the White House. Each week at this time, we take an hour and a half to look at what the announced and unannounced candidates for president are doing and saying around the country. This week, we'll discuss Senator Sam Nunn's announcement not to run, and also former Senator Paul Laxalt's decision to drop out of the presidential race. Joining us will be Ray Strother, a Democratic consultant, and Eddie Mai, a Republican political consultant. We'll also stop by the Taste of Thailand restaurant in downtown Des Moines, Iowa, to look at the results of a presidential preference poll they conducted recently among their customers. We'll travel to Manchester, New Hampshire for a meeting between former Governor Bruce Babbitt and the owners of several daycare centers in the area. And finally, we'll follow Vice President George Bush through a parade in Londonderry, New Hampshire. We begin our program this week with a look at former Senator Paul Laxalt of Nevada. Up until Wednesday of this past week, the former senator was doing all the things a candidate for president would do. Just last week, we followed Senator Laxalt in New Hampshire as he stopped in to visit with Joe the Barber in Milford, New Hampshire.
Is this the place?
This is the place. You know who this fella is?
God, I like the color of your hair and the cut.
You know who this fella is?
Do I know him?
Yeah.
I think so.
Joe. Governor, how are you? It's been a long time.
I
can remember the job that you're doing now as I did for you going around town a few years
that's
back.
right.
You remember
For him?
I told him.
Yes.
that one.
Yeah,
I
when he
told
was
him he
running for
couldn't come
governor.
to Milford without coming here.
You've got to come here. This is the
This is the
Cadillac of
universe,
all
isn't
the
it?
places.
Isn't this the universe?
That's true. Listen, if you've got this man backing you, you've got to be an ultra-conservative. There's no question about it.
No, I really.
You've got to be.
You know what I
You've
am?
gotta be. There's no question.
You know what I
about
am?
that.
I'm really a closet liberal. I've just got improved.
God, it's time we had someone like you, really. You know
Really?
what? I was talking earlier, and I said, it'd been a good idea if you'd started probably a little bit earlier. Might have gotten some that went the other direction. Maybe you can bring them back. I
Yeah,
hope,
we're
but-
going to work on that.
Bring 'em back.
And there are an
That's
awful lot of people that never been
your
involved
help,
before
Joe.
that we get.
Sure. Yeah,
That'd
fine.
be great. How's business?
No problem.
I tell you, I'll be in
I'm
here
on
and get
Medicare, and I feel great.
Are you
about
working
it. Sure, I work.
regularly?
Yes. Yeah.
He gave up his
I'm going
lunch
on
to meet you.
39 and pushing 40
You're all right.
on one side.
What we'll be
Well,
doing,
listen.
I'll be coming in for a haircut occasionally.
Sure.
Yeah,
You
we're
drop
going to be
by
here a
and say,
lot.
Sure.
I like the color of your hair and the
all right,
style.
listen, I like your. I was looking at that right there. I said, oh, you can't beat that.
Can't beat that, huh?
Yeah, I'm trying to figure. You had one job down there, and you had this job. I'm trying to figure who did them.
See, he's a
Yeah.
kid.
No.
Excuse me.
Yeah.
He's still dark around the edges. you
Yeah,
know?
yeah.
Oh, no, I'm not really.
That's good though. Yeah, you look good though.
Thank you,
Good
I'm
shape.
fine,
Good
thank
work.
you.
Formula. Is that right? We have it up there. We call it youth hair. That's true. Well, listen, it's been awful nice, and nice to see you too again, Governor. Really.
I'll be
Yeah.
back.
Well, I hope
Joe,
so.
good luck to
luck.
you.
Well, good
We'll
luck
be
to you,
back
too.
in and say
Yeah,
hello from
fine.
time to time.
Beautiful.
Thank you.
Nice to see you.
Nice to meet you, Joe.
Thank you, ma'am.
Daddy used to be a barber back in Nevada.
That's right.
Is that right?
Yes,
Yeah.
Angelo.
Listen, you know what I heard about, see, I'm on the barber board here in the States, see, for barbering. So one time when I went to Las Vegas over there, they tell me the only way you can get a license in Nevada, I hope you don't think I'm saying this
No,
wrong.
no.
It says somebody's gonna die and then they'll take his place. I don't know whether that's
Is it
true.
that tight
No.
there now?
Well, because I'm trying to think who I knew over there. Heavy set fella that was.
Where, in Las Vegas or
Yeah,
Reno? In Las Vegas?
Yeah, he
Uh-huh.
was on the board over there. Yeah, I go to the meetings and national meetings. So, in fact, I was lucky enough to be in Las Vegas to be a national president of the association.
Did
about
you help
3
our
years ago.
economy?
Always did, never failed. That was one of the things.
Thank you.
Who did you say your dad was?
Angelo Bernardini, but I don't think you probably
That's a
would know.
good Irishman, right there. Just like mine being a Swiss.
That's right. Swizinski.
I felt that the same way like being Italian because I end with a vowel.
That's
The
right.
I. Good luck
Bye-bye.
to you. Yeah,
Thank
we'll see you again.
Okay.
That was 1 week ago. On Wednesday, the Laxalt campaign released this announcement, quote, "We have thoroughly tested the political and financial waters for the past 4 months. While the political response was encouraging, the financial outlook was not as bright. We are a family of very modest means, and I wasn't about to embark on a campaign that would lead us into a financial black hole. The money, in my opinion, would have been inadequate to conduct a viable presidential campaign," end of quote. Also this week, Senator Sam Nunn, Democrat of Georgia, announced that he would not be a candidate for president, saying he had too many responsibilities with the Armed Services Committee. He said he would make a poor presidential candidate because he would be too distracted by his duties with the Armed Services Committee. To get an idea of what the impact would be on the announcements from Senator Nunn and former Senator Laxalt, we asked Republican consultant Eddie Mai for his reaction.
Well, the immediate reaction has to be one of sadness to some extent because obviously Senator Laxalt is a high-quality human being, and he would have been a credit to the party and a credit to the country if he'd have been successful.
Is it a surprise?
Well, yes, probably, perhaps, but you know when he got in late it was going to be a tough road to hoe, and Paul is a practical human being, and when he saw what he was into, I guess I'm not surprised that he decided to cut his losses now and get out.
Was his organization in trouble? Was he having trouble implementing a presidential campaign organization?
Probably to some extent, because a lot of people who would have been absolutely on the Paul Laxalt team, when they became convinced earlier this year that he was not going to run, they went off and committed to other candidates. And being the kind of people they are, they were not comfortable breaking those commitments. So many of the Laxalt loyalists were not on the Laxalt team.
Now, one of the major reasons that he's given for not running is that he didn't want to go into this financial black hole, he says. Does that say something about the process? Is it becoming simply too expensive to run for president?
Well, it is very expensive to run for president. It shall forevermore be expensive to run for president. The question may be who's going to pay for it, but it's got to be expensive. You're communicating with 250 million people scattered across 50 states. That's got to cost a lot of money.
How much money does a campaign, in your estimate, how much money do they have to have, like, say, right now, before Labor Day in order to be credible?
Well, I would think if they are not at least raised and spent and have a mechanism to continue to raise money well in excess of $1 million a month, I think they are on very thin ice in a presidential race.
Now, this is the second Republican to say he's not going to run for financial reasons. Donald Rumsfeld earlier in the year said he just wasn't going to go into debt, and now Senator Paul Laxalt. What does that say about the system, and what does it say about the future of the presidential selection process?
Well, again, I think it's commendable on both of those gentlemen's part that they made the decision not to go into debt and end up ripping off a lot of people and individual small business owners, as other candidates have done at times. But if you start a campaign in time and methodically put it together, as Pete DuPont, for example, has done, as Congressman Gephardt has done, I think it demonstrates that the money can be raised to put together a creditable campaign. I'm not at all sure that Don Rumsfeld maybe did not make the decision a little bit prematurely about whether or not the camp money could be raised. But in Paul's case, it was because he started very late, in my opinion. If he'd have started in January, I think money would not have been a problem.
Now, he consistently on the campaign trail would say things like, this is a long-distance race, we don't need to begin until Labor Day, everybody else is going to wear themselves out too early. Has he proven himself wrong in that reality? Presidential campaign has got to run for almost 4 years before the fact.
I think it either runs for about 4 years, and I think you were either on the playing field active, maybe not announced, but on the playing field active and going real hard by last fall in time to be participating in the off-year elections, or you wait until January or February of next year and see if lightning strikes.
Now, who immediately gains from Senator Laxalt dropping out?
Seems to me there are potentially 3 people that might gain. Number one, Jack Kemp. Those people whose decision is in this process is driven primarily by philosophy. I think Jack Kemp will reap a harvest among some of those people. Others whose commitment is driven heavily by their feeling for Ronald Reagan personally and wanting to be loyal to Ronald Reagan, and to the extent that Vice President Bush has attracted a lot of those people, I think this will take the pressure off others of them and make it possible for them to commit. And because with Paul Laxalt out of the race, Pete DuPont has probably a better chance of getting the endorsement of the Manchester Union leader. It clearly might benefit him as well.
The polls seem to show that things are solidified on the Republican side. Vice President first, Senator Dole second, Representative Kemp perhaps third, and then on down. Do you believe any of those polls? Do they mean anything at this point?
Not a great deal. I mean, again, yes, it demonstrates the strength at the beginning of the race. And we are still at the beginning of the race. Paul Laxalt was correct in that. And Labor Day is not really the beginning as either, because I don't see how these folks can be working any harder after Labor Day than they've been working in the month of August, as witness to travel your crews have been doing. But it means that George Bush is a lot better known across the country than Jack Kemp is. And so that's what you're getting a tremendous reflection of. Again, we go back 4 years ago when Gary Hart was unknown. He had 1 or 2% in the polls on the day of the Iowa primaries, and 3 weeks later he was winning New Hampshire. So you have to take those early polls with a big, big, big chunk of salt.
Senator Sam Nunn is also out of the race. What's your reaction to that?
Well, it surely has to be a happy day in Jesse Jackson's headquarters, I would think, because I would think that many of the right of center, white, kind of Democrat-oriented conservatives in the South will now be more comfortable going into Republican primary because they do not have anyone that even faintly resembles a conservative left in their race.
Does it hurt the Democratic field as a whole?
Well, I think to the extent it eliminates any debate, yes. I mean, you've just got a bunch of clones out there all fairly much saying the same thing and arguing over minutiae, but nobody articulating any differences as to major policy.
Eddie Mai, you're a well-known political consultant, but you're not even going to get into this presidential thing this year. You're not doing any presidential campaigns this time around. Why not?
Oh, we have not ruled it out. At this time, there has just not seemed to be a compelling reason yet to do that.
Eddie Mai, thanks for your time.
Thank you.
We also spoke with Democratic consultant Ray Strother. Senator Sam Nunn isn't in the race. What's the impact?
Well, I think it frees a lot of people now for either Geb Hart or Al Gore. I think it does both of their campaigns a great deal of good. There was a lot of bet hedging in the South because of Nunn's presence in the race, or almost presence in the race. So I think a lot of the power brokers, when I say that with some respect, the people who have the ability to raise money within the Democratic system, within the Democratic Party, are now free to support other candidates. And I think there'll probably be a mad scramble right now between the Gore camps and the Geb Hart camps to pick up some of them. I think they're the big beneficiaries of this.
So a lot of phones are probably ringing in the South right now.
If these campaigns are well organized, I'm confident that's true. You know, I told someone this morning, I said, if you listen very carefully, there's a hum in the air, and that's a collective sigh of relief from the other candidates that Sam Nunn didn't get in the race.
Now, talk about that whole process. What is happening now? Then you can only assume then that some of these other campaigns are calling these so-called power brokers. How long will that courting process take place? Will it be quick, take a long time? What will happen?
Well, it's like peacocks dancing, you know, around each other. It'll be a process that'll take 2 or 3 weeks. But people who are engaged in politics and presidential campaigns every 4 years hate to be left out. So I suspect they're assessing their chances and their opportunities, and they're looking at candidates now. So in a couple of weeks, we'll see a lot of settling down of the people who really matter as far as fundraising, organization, and presidential campaign, the Bob Strausses of the country.
Now, Eddie Mai, a Republican consultant, says that this hurts the Democratic Party as a whole because it leaves the voters with a Democratic field that I believe he called them just Democratic clones, Democratic lookalikes, and none of them can really sell in the South. What do you think of that?
Well, let's remind everybody watching that Eddie Mai is a right-wing Republican. He's not objective, and he's wrong. There's nothing wrong with the candidates we have out there. It's one of the best fields we've ever had. And I don't agree with this 7 dwarf theory the press is expressing now. I think we have some really fine candidates out there, and there are 3 or 4 of them that make great presidents. So that's wishful Republican thinking, what Eddie Mai says.
But the popular wisdom seems to have been that a conservative Democrat would do best down there. Is that candidate now left in the race?
Well, a conservative Democrat would do best in a region. But remember, I don't think you can run for president of the United States from just one region. I think you have to have a broader base than that. The South was simply a platform for someone to campaign from. It wasn't an end in itself. Therefore, I think if Gore can work very hard in the South and establish himself as the Southern candidate, that's an opportunity for him to build a campaign. It's not the campaign.
What does it do for the Reverend Jesse Jackson's campaign?
I don't know that it changes Jesse Jackson's campaign at all. I think that's the least impact of all. He has a built-in constituency, a constituency that he does very well with, and I don't think that was a non-constituency to start with, except maybe some in Georgia. But I think that Jesse Jackson's unaffected by this. I think he'll continue running as well as he's running now, which is quite well.
Any surprises you see coming up in the future? Any people who might now get into the race because Senator Nunn's not in it?
Well, I won't predict a surprise, but I think there will be a surprise. I mean, I won't predict who it will be anyway. I think there's ample opportunity for an outsider to get in the race and change the presidential race again. I thought Bill Clinton would do it a few weeks ago. But someone like that who would have the courage to bypass the Iowa process and would stand outside the gates of Iowa and beat the drums loudly for the rest of the country, I think could still get in this race and still win.
Now, the polls seem to show that there's nobody sort of taking off. There's no really clear frontrunner on the Democratic side. When you look at the polls, a lot of people, no one's busted out of the pack. Does that tell us anything about the current status of the campaign, and do you believe these polls?
Well, it tells us it's politics as usual. This is too early. It's too early for anyone to break out of the pack, and in my personal opinion, the candidates are too frantic to try to establish themselves in that pack. It's irrelevant at the moment. They better pick up the people who can help them organize and raise money and not worry about where they are in the polls right now. If you'll remember, in 1983, in December, I was representing Gary Hart, and we had 4% name recognition nationwide in 1983. I'm talking about a month or so before the Iowa primary. So Hart burst onto the scene in a race that everybody said belonged to John Glenn and Walter Mondale. So there's plenty of time, and I think the candidates should not necessarily relax, but should focus their attention on the insiders and the people who can help them with their campaigns later, and quit worrying about jockeying around and worrying about who's 2 points ahead of whom at this point.
You were originally from Louisiana, spent a lot of time in politics in Louisiana. Who's best organized right now in the South, in your opinion?
As a loyal Texan, let me say I'm a Texan who lived in Louisiana.
Excuse me.
Who's best organized? I think Gebhardt has probably made the best forays into the South at the moment, and seems to have the nucleus of a building organization there. He's worked at it for a long time.
Also in the news, former Senator Paul Laxalt has decided not to get into the race. What's your impressions of that?
I think the most interesting thing when Laxalt decided not to run, I read in the paper, was what was not said. What was not said is Reagan coattails are not great things to have right now. And that he's having trouble raising money because a clone of Reagan, or a very close friend of Reagan, let's be charitable, the man, he's a good man, has trouble raising money at the moment, where 4 years ago a hot Reagan candidacy, a hot Reagan White House would have been a great platform to raise money from. It's not now. So I think that's what really is going on. Laxalt is sinking with Reagan.
Now, one of the things we've heard twice now, there's been two Republicans who have decided not to get into the race because they didn't want to, in their words, they didn't want to run up a huge debt. They didn't want to go into debt. What does that tell us about the process? Has it become simply too expensive to run for president?
It's incredibly expensive. It's too expensive. It does disservice to the system. It does disservice to the country. And we have to find some way to control the nominating process. States like Iowa, just ridiculous what they're doing. We're spending so much money in a little state for a handful of people to decide who the nominee will be, and it's not right. It's not right. I don't know if we should have a national primary or not. Maybe I'm not the one who should decide that. But we have to stop this crazy expenditure of money in the nominating process. It serves no one well.
But are we on an irreversible system now, and that it's only going to become more expensive, that it's impossible to put a ceiling on this?
I think one bold candidate could stop the whole thing right now, because what everybody's doing is marching in lockstep to the Carter plan for getting the nomination. First you start with Iowa, then you jump to New Hampshire. And I think someone who was willing and had the courage could say, look, Iowa's not important, America's important, New Hampshire's not important except how it fits in the rest of the country. And I'm going to run a national campaign, and I'm not going to pick it apart one state at a time. I think that person could still come in later in the campaign and still win.
Senator Laxalt was also fighting conventional wisdom in that in his stump speeches, he would say that the race really didn't begin until Labor Day. Criticized his opponents because they were starting much, much too early. Now he's at a point, doesn't have the organization, and he backs out. Is the lesson from that in fact one does have to run for 4 years in advance before you run for president?
Well, I hate to agree with Laxalt on anything, but the truth is you do have to start really early inside. You have to start organizing, getting people in place, and raising money. You don't have to start media exposure. You don't have to start the frantic displays and the frantic debate schedule that they have now, or the handshaking tours they have now. I think it's still too early for all that. But at this point, if someone hasn't done all of the inside work, it's more difficult for them to get in, yes.
In '84, you were a consultant to Senator Hart's presidential campaign. Are you going to get into this '88 race in any way?
Well, I tried very hard to stay out of it. and the lure is unbelievable. So yes, I'll probably get back in it, and I'm talking to 2 or 3 candidates now.
And you won't tell us who, I suppose.
Well, no, I better not say that.
Ray Strother, thanks for your time.
Thank you.
Appreciate it. Before we forget about him, let's go back to Milford, New Hampshire and speak with Joe Swazinski, the local barber. Tell us something about the town you live in, Milford. What kind of town is this?
Well, we're Republican orientated, if that's what you're looking for. We have a population of approximately 10,000 people. Our industry is not as great as you'd like to have it, but we do have a Hitchin Manufacturing Company here that makes golf clubs for Spalding, Wilson, and whatever, and some small electronic companies.
Now, you're a barber. What kind of heads do you cut?
Well, actually, we cut all kinds, in a sense. You know, we go from styling through to regular haircuts to even to the mohawks. We have some, once in a while, an Ollie North haircut.
A lot of punks come in here and get punk haircuts?
So that's a bad way of putting it. They're all nice people, but they have punk cuts. That's what you mean.
Tell us something more about politics. A lot of candidates up in New Hampshire working their way around, shaking hands. Are you seeing a lot of the presidential candidates?
At this point, all I've seen has been Jack Kemp, who's come through. But because it's still early, but I'm sure that we'll be getting a lot more, and we usually do. This area is, we're not like the city, of course, but Milford has always had a good reputation of having candidates come through. And I think this time there'll be some more like they've had in the past.
Now, you just met with former Senator Laxalt. What'd you think of Senator Laxalt?
Well, I tell you the truth, I've always sort of liked him in a sense. I think he's got that not the tag along, but the same thoughts I think that President Reagan has, pretty much on the conservative side, and I kind of appreciate that pretty much.
Are people at this stage, late summer, are they thinking at all about presidential politics? Are people talking about it when they come and sit in this barber chair?
Very, very little at this point. I don't think it'll take a while before it gets going. And you're speaking about the town as far as the politics. They're pretty much conservative, in this town. I think throughout the whole state they are also. Unless we have a lot of outsiders that move in and cause us a little difficulty on their thinking. Right now, I said we'd like to keep it the way it is.
Now, are they all in a pack, or is anybody starting to take off? Any of the Republicans starting to take off from the pack and become any kind of a front runner here in New Hampshire?
Gee, I can't honestly say that. I've listened, like I told you earlier, I've listened to Vice President Bush. I think he came on pretty good over there in the Votech School in Nashua. Jack Kemp, like I said, was in, but as far as somebody being a front runner, I can't honestly say that, because polls say Dukakis is in front, but I think you'll find there'll be a big turnaround by the time it comes down to the nitty-gritty.
Joe Swazinski, thank you very much for your time.
You're welcome.
Appreciate it.
With roughly a third of all delegates to be selected next March 8 in the Southern Regional Primary, it's no wonder that many of the candidates are stressing their ties to the South. The Des Moines Register ran this front-page editorial cartoon recently showing Senator Paul Simon dressed as Lincoln and pointing out that, geographically, he's a Southerner.
Good day and welcome to Des Moines, Iowa. Our next stop on Road to the White House is the Taste of Thailand restaurant in downtown Des Moines. Taste of Thailand restaurant is conducting a presidential preference poll, and we're going to find out what they've learned over the course of the summer. Joining us for a few minutes is Dan Levitas, and he's a polling committee member and a restaurant regular. Dan, tell me a few things about this poll. Where did the idea of this poll come from?
Well, from the restaurant patrons and the owner himself. We got together and decided that to sample the opinion of people of Iowa and people here in Des Moines. What better way than to tap the flow of opinion from the regular restaurant customers here?
How serious is this poll?
Well, we're pretty serious about it. We enjoy a good time, but we tabulate the results, and when you look at them and they're all done and laid out before you, you can actually see a few things, some trends developing.
What kind of trends have you seen?
Well, we've seen the relative popularity of candidates kind of rise and fall, mirroring some of the national polls or other statewide polls. For example, after the Houston debates, kind of the fall off of the Bruce Babbitt campaign, and Jesse Jackson kind of holding steady in the lead after Gary Hart dropped out, and kind of a persistent early interest in Lee Iacocca among people polled, which, mirrored some early polls. But relatively, you can learn a lot.
Is there any one person been leading throughout the summer?
Well, I think Jackson's shown himself to be, strongly in the lead. I think the interesting thing now over the past several months is to see the other candidates that occupied only 1 or 2 or 3% come up into that 14 and 15% range. So you see other candidates gaining strength now.
What about on the Republican side?
On the Republican side, we've seen some kind of variation and flip-flops between Dole and Bush, and it's interesting to see that Pat Robertson stay low, relatively low throughout the polling period, not really gaining very much strength. But as you can see over there, clearly we've got Bob Dole's in the lead, and George Bush is coming up close behind with a second.
And what about other issues? You ask more than questions about presidential politics. What are the kinds of questions do you ask, and what have you found out?
Well, we asked people if they thought it would be a good idea to build a skywalk from Creston to Des Moines, which is about 60 miles away. We asked people if we think they had a happy childhood. We asked them about aid to the Contras. One of my favorite questions was where they thought Jim and Tammy Baker would end up. And those kinds of responses were interesting. So we sprinkle in some human interest with some sincere political interest.
What kind of person eats at Taste of Thailand?
Well, I think really the restaurant, it's a great place to eat. Food's wonderful, and there's a lot of people that are attracted here. But I think as the poll indicates, it appears to be the more people eat here have a preference towards Democratic Party politics, I would guess. But there are plenty of other independent-minded people that eat here as well.
Now, when they come in, how does it work? Somebody walks in the door and all they want is Thai food, and you handing them a poll, and then what happens?
Well, it's a little more casual than that. They eat their meal, and something to do while they're going through the menu and waiting for their food to come. The person that's waiting on the table can bring them a ballot. We'll bring them a ballot and with a pen, and they can go through and mark the ballot, and then those ballots can be collected with the check or before the meal comes.
What about a polling booth? Do you have a special place if they want to vote?
Yeah, there's a polling booth right there if they really feel privacy and they don't want to argue or debate or have their neighbors peeking over their shoulder while they're voting. But actually, it's a topic for discussion. I know when I come here and fill out the ballot, we usually kind of talk amongst ourselves, and sometimes there's one ballot that comes with all the several ballots with a similar write-in candidate or a similar write-in answer, and you know that people have been talking at the table amongst one another.
Now, what do you get out of being a polling committee member?
Well, there's a big, wonderful banquet on Sunday evenings that Pak, the restaurant manager, prepares, and of course that's on the house, which is very courteous of him, and so we sit around and eat some good food and then get to work.
Dan Levitas, thanks for your time.
Thank you.
Prasang Nurak, you own this restaurant. Why are you running a presidential preference poll in a Thai restaurant?
We want to be the good part of American democratic society.
And by just finding out what they're doing is your contribution to democracy?
I think so.
Now, do you have a special interest in politics?
I have some basic background. I have a political science study in the college, in the American college here.
What school did you study at?
Northeastern Illinois.
What have you learned? Are there any general trends you've learned from running this poll for 6 months?
We took class in the political research, and we have a friend, here they're interested in doing the same thing. So why don't we do together and find out something?
Now, is this as much fun as it is serious?
It's fun and recollect the knowledge of all of us too. Recollection of the knowledge we learned in the school. Everyone here, we interested in doing that.
Are you originally from Thailand?
Yes, we born there. We grew up there.
When did you come to the United States?
1971.
How good is the food at Taste of Thailand?
One of the best in the country. Thank you. Nice to meet you.
The Taste of Thailand restaurant conducted a presidential preference poll among its customers between July 11 and August 9th. 884 customers responded to the question of who they thought the next president would be. Governor Michael Dukakis was first with 25%, Senator Simon was second with 24%, Jesse Jackson received 20%, Senator Biden 12%, Representative Gephardt and Governor Bruce Babbitt received 8%, and Senator Albert Gore Jr. received 3%. On the Republican side, Senator Bob Dole was first with 36%, Vice President Bush was second with 24%, General Haig received 16%, Governor DuPont 13%, Representative Kemp 5%, the Reverend Pat Robertson received 4%, and former Senator Paul Laxalt received 2%. Finally, 24% of the 884 responses indicated they were still undecided. When the Taste of Thailand restaurant asked their customers where they thought Jim and Tammy Baker would end up, 6% said heaven, 22% said jail, 20% said hell, and 52% said Switzerland. Let's return now to New Hampshire, site of the first in the nation primary next February 16. In downtown Manchester, New Hampshire, there's a restaurant called The Vault. It's a common hangout for political activists and candidates running for president. On the day we were there, former Arizona Governor Bruce Babbitt had rented a room at the restaurant to meet with owners of daycare centers in Manchester.
What I'd like to discuss and have some give and take on today are a set of children's issues, particularly early childhood, particularly emphasis on the care issues, daycare, latchkey, preschool, to try to share some of the experiences. It's an area that I think is really emerging very rapidly as one of the major neglected social issues in this country. And as I run for president, part of the fun of this process is the ability, being up there on the platform, to take an issue that's been neglected and by your advocacy and speeches to simply stick that issue in front of the American people and say, here it is, let's get it in the agenda and really get moving on it. I began to get interested in the children's issues kind of in a roundabout way. When I became governor, I was interested and eager to get moving on the economic issues. My feeling was that before we could really get to the social agenda, we had to get moving on economic growth. And my interest began in that area. And to some degree, I still think it's an economic issue. If America is going to compete, if we're going to create real economic growth, if we're going to be able to take advantage of the opportunities in a changing world, we have to make basic changes in American society. I've talked about some of those. I've talked about a concept I call workplace democracy, which is a way of bringing out the best and the creative energies in workers and motivating them by talking about giving them a stake in the success of businesses with profit sharing, cooperative management, encouraging employee ownership. Talked about the absolute necessity of getting that budget deficit under control, because if we don't, we simply steal from the future of our children. I've talked about an important concept called universal needs testing, which is a way of putting priorities into the budget. But the third concept is children, because if we're going to make these changes and if we're going to restructure American society to take advantage of the future, who's the future? It's our children. I began worrying during my early years as governor about the dropout rate. I was speechless the first time I heard from Mrs. Warner, the State Superintendent of Public Instruction, that nationwide 30% of our kids are dropping out of school, because it called into question all of these other concepts about economic growth and interest rates and workplace democracy. I mean, what kind of chance do we have if a third of our kids are dropping out of high school? And I began asking myself, why is that? And I found, I believe, the beginnings of an answer in an unlikely place. I found the beginnings of an answer in a first grade classroom in a suburban Phoenix elementary school. I was visiting that school now quite a few years ago. And the teacher was showing me around a first grade classroom, and I was kind of mixing it up with all the kids. And off in a corner, I saw a small, kind of shy boy standing all by himself. And I walked up to him and held my hand out and smiled and looked him in the eye. And he reacted in terror and ran to the other end of the room and clutched his teacher's skirt and kind of buried himself in it. After the class was over, I followed the teacher out and I said, well, what's that all about? And she said, I'll tell you what that's all about. That child was discovered about 5 months ago living in an orange crate in a packing shed, black and blue from beating, unable to even speak because nobody had bothered to teach the kid how to talk. And she said, I think you understand that the sight of an adult, of a strange adult, is a cause for terror. And, I looked at the teacher and I said, how can this happen in my state and in this community? And she looked at me and she said, Governor, that's the question that I'm asking you. And I took a deep breath and I went home that night and put my 2 sons to bed and sat up and thought about it and began asking a series of questions which led me to the discovery that children are being badly neglected all over this society, that if there's one place in American society where we've defaulted on our moral obligations as people, it's the neglect, abuse, and inattention to our children. Now, once I begun to understand that, I began going out to the advocacy groups in the Arizona community and saying, I'm outraged. What can we do about these things? And I got an interesting response. They said, well, it's not enough to go out and give a nice speech to an advocacy group. You've got to do something more than just talk about it. They persuaded me to go up to the Arizona legislature in my annual State of the State address and do something that I had never even considered, and it had a wonderful impact. I went up to the Arizona legislature in January of that year and I said, there are many things that we can talk about. Water development, roads, health care, corrections. But at the root of all of these issues is the people who will inherit the future, our kids. And I'm going to talk to you this year about nothing except the plight of our children. And I stood there for 40 minutes and laid out a series of proposals. The initial reaction was kind of skeptical. People said, why don't you talk about something serious? Why are you lecturing us about children instead of something serious? But it didn't last long because there was an overwhelming public response. Got a lot of pressure on the legislature. And for the first time really began to move. We dealt with the issues of child abuse. We revamped the foster care system, got into the issues of early childhood education, expanded our health care system to provide much, much broader coverage for children. And perhaps most importantly, began to get into these issues of daycare and early childhood education. We put together a voucher-based daycare system which provides on a universal basis assistance to working parents. I think it's an important concept. There was some resistance in the early days because people said, well, isn't that welfare? I said, wait a minute. Daycare is the exact opposite of welfare because what you're doing is providing an incentive to parents who want to take charge of their lives and go out into the workforce. And underlying it all, I think, is just this simple premise, and I think it's the place to finish and start a discussion, and that is that the first grade really is too late in the late 20th century. It may have been the appropriate place to begin the formal institutional process 100 years ago, but society's changed in all these incredible ways. Kids are at risk a lot earlier. There are more and more single parents out there struggling to make a living, families where both parents are out working just to provide the level of help that would have been provided by one parent in my generation. And I think the time is at hand to have a national debate and a national inquiry into what do we do, what are our collective obligations as a society in those early years. If, in fact, as I contend, the first grade is too late, how do we build a stair-step of assistance, nurture, help to families, early childhood education? What do we learn from the experience of Head Start? What do we learn from the waiting lists all over this country for adequate daycare? What's the trade-off in the daycare system between just custody and viewing it as nurture and education? How do we finance it? What's the federal role? If any of you can answer all of those questions, you will continue in the tradition of Solomon, and America will be forever grateful. But let's see what we can find out about it. Mary Jane?
I've heard you speak a number of times about child care and your concern for children, and I guess I'd like to know if you've gone any farther in your thoughts in developing a national child care voucher system. That was something that you've spoken to child care people in New Hampshire about, and I wondered how that was coming together and what your thoughts are on that.
I've spent a lot of time visiting quality daycare centers, and in each case asking the question, how do you manage to include the kids of low-income working parents? Now, how do you finance it? Because if a parent is in a minimum wage job at $6,800 a year, they can't. How much do you charge a parent who can afford it for a week of daycare? Okay, so that'd be $300 some a month. That would be times 12 would be nearly $4,000 a year. So there's the dilemma. We say to a parent, most often a mother, get off welfare, go to work, often in a minimum wage job, $6,800 a year, and you're telling me that daycare is going to cost nearly $4,000 a year. That's the dilemma. And what we did in Arizona was to start with a universal entitlement, really kind of in the form of a voucher, to say to parents, if you need the support, we'll give it to you in voucher form to help you pay the expense. Now, the model that we started with is not terribly adequate. It's about, depending on the exact circumstance, it starts off about $40 a week, and then phases out as your income gets up to about $15,000 a year. But it seems to me the concept is correct, and the question that I would have for all of you is that concept correct? Because see, what it would do is say, we're going to put the purchasing power in the hands of the working parents, rather than having a grant program, which kind of comes through the state and federal government, and which sort of is on and off and up and down. We would put that purchasing power in the hands of parents to use. Now, there are a lot of details, but that's conceptually what it's all about.
I'm concerned about how you can maintain quality health care, because a lot of quality teachers have very little incentive when the pay is $11,000, $12,000 a year. And how do you say to people out there, not only with health, with child care, but hey, the social service is a worthwhile career to go into, and we want you to go into that, but they work for a year, they get burnt out, they're gone, and then it goes right on down to the children. How do you make that attractive?
Well, I'd like to hear some people about that. See, I think in the old days it was pretty easy because there was a tendency to think of daycare as just kind of a warm body, you know, kind of keeping track of a child so it doesn't, you know, walk off a ledge, changing its diapers and feeding it a couple times a day. My problem with that is I'm as certain as I can be from my own experience with my kids that daycare ought to be more than that, that the education process begins the day a child is born, and that the most important part of it is he is, you know, well in advance of the first grade, and that, you know, when my kids were in a daycare setting, I was tremendously concerned and you know, over there asking what kind of learning experience is going on. Now, what you're saying is, you know, how do you get the kind of people you want if you're paying them minimum wages? Well, my question is, somebody help me. I think it's a fair question.
Well, are you talking about daycare under 6, or he's talking about public schools?
No,
I'm
The
talking
daycare, well, the
daycare, social service.
well, the daycare center, they usually charge it. I know I've got 2 grandchildren that go to 2 different daycare centers. One's Babyland and the other is, I've forgotten what the name of it is, Happy Care or something like that. And she pays about $70 a week for each child. It depends upon what the daycare charges.
Oh, no, okay, I'm not talking about a fee.
So that's
I'm
why
talking about
the
how do we
private
maintain a quality staff when we have very little incentive to keep that staff? We're paying them
Yeah.
low wages.
Look, what you're saying, I think, is this.
You mean with do you mean the daycare center for the poor children? Like we have the daycare center on Main Street that pay the people go there that have to pay a sliding scale.
Yeah, but see, that's the
We have
issue.
both different.
What kind of wages can you afford to pay in a daycare center which hopefully has kids whose parents can pay and kids who need assistance? I mean, that would surely be the ideal, wouldn't it, to try to have a mix?
From my experience, what I would see as being ideal would be that daycares were mixed. There were low-income, moderate-income, and high-income families all using the same facilities. But the clue there will be, will the voucher system pay enough? Will there be enough funds in the voucher system so that those low and moderate-income families will be able to buy in to that quality of childcare that you're talking about? I think that's one of the things we need to really think about. I'm also wondering about the mix of money as far as federal and state money into a voucher system. Would we look at a state matching system? It varies so much from state to state now. It depends. You're so dependent on what your state will do, what your state legislators will do. There's no national, we haven't come up with a real national philosophy about what we're going to do about child care. It's different from state to state.
Yeah, I guess my view would be conceptually that a national program ought to be modeled on many of the other entitlement programs. That the federal government would say, for example, to the states, we'll pay 50% of the cost of a program which meets these minimum standards, and then define what it is states would do to qualify, in addition to paying the other 50%. But you do still have the problem of how expensive does the program have to be in order to provide real assistance to that mother that we just described who has come off welfare, is in a minimum wage job. I mean, not all of them go to minimum wage jobs. Make that assumption, $6,800 a year, and you're sending her a bill for $3,000 a year for half of her disposable income.
In the fact sheet that was handed out before the meeting talking about daycare and government role in daycare, you suggest that there need to be some more incentives for employers to offer daycare. And one of the concerns that I have relates to that and relates to a concern about a voucher-based system, which is, to a certain extent, it seems to me we are subsidizing employers as much as we are employees in that situation. especially if we allow the minimum wage to stay at whatever it is now, $3.55 an hour.
Yeah, but don't you want to subsidize? I mean, think of the employer not as an employer, but as a operator of a daycare center. I mean, don't you really want to stimulate that? And wouldn't the voucher system do it?
Most employers, I think, even if you give them even if it's not the money coming in that's stopping an employer from running a daycare center. I think it's the other hassles involved in running a daycare center that stop them from running a daycare center. I am doing some work trying to, and I would like to encourage the federal government, I think, to do some work to get employers to, A, pay employees a living wage so that they can afford to take care of their children, rather than have the government take care of the children for the parents.
Suppose you were to pass a law saying the federal government should raise the minimum wage, and I happen to think that it's outrageous to have a minimum wage of $3.40 an hour. You can't possibly support a family or meet your responsibilities on that kind of wage. What would happen if you raised the minimum wage and said to the employer, you may either raise the minimum wage or, in lieu of the raise, provide an equivalent amount of daycare benefits?
Well, then what happens to the people who are earning the minimum wage who don't have any children that would be
Then they get paid the minimum wage.
Well, they'd get paid the minimum wage. I mean, all I'm saying is we must raise the minimum wage, and the only question is, how do you give out the compensation?
You're just trying to find a way of subsidizing this thing and other kinds of needs of children.
Yeah, really, that's right.
Without hitting the employer, without hitting the federal government, without hitting the state government, without hitting the parents.
If you figure out how to do that.
The point is that a lot of the things that are suggested, because we hate federalism and we don't want tax dollars supporting people, is that we try and push a lot of responsibility off on private enterprise, on the private sector, and we have them subsidizing daycare, or health care, or maternity leaves, when it really is a national responsibility, I think. And it's not something that you ask one segment of the society to fund, when it's a responsibility for all of us. Other countries recognize that.
Okay, what should we do about preschool? Now, by preschool, I think what we're talking about is 4-year-olds. That is the year before kindergarten. I was present in the War on Poverty in 1965 when Head Start was invented and funded. What has always struck me over the intervening years is that every single study that's been made of Head Start reaches a conclusion that it does persist in its benefits and has an absolutely documentable positive effect. Here we are, nearly 25 years later, and we still do not have anything resembling a universal accessibility to preschool in this country. I take it you would approve of doing that.
In New Hampshire, we don't even have mandatory kindergarten. That's right. So we have that year to struggle with when we get to the 4-year-olds.
Well, it's interesting. There are a number of states remaining in this union where kindergarten is not available in the public school system. We went through that fight in Arizona back in the 70s, and I must say, in retrospect, it seems to me incomprehensible that we can have a community or an environment where there is not universally available kindergarten.
We went through that fight in the 70s. It didn't pass.
Teddy?
I had a couple of questions. One is, I'd like you to tell us what the Latchkey program in Arizona did for children. I mean, did you find in the community, what results did it bring with the children not on the streets and bothering the police or doing I don't know what with the latchkey system? I approve of it. I think if the schools could stay open 24 hours a day, it would be good. But the other thing was that we had a hearing not too long ago. I think it was the New Hampshire People's Alliance, and it had to do with insurance for those of the uninsured in the state. And this young man, he's impressed me so much, got up and testified that he held 3 part-time jobs a week. A young man with a wife trying to raise a family because no employer would hire him full-time because then he'd have to pay the benefits. Now, this is sinful.
That's,
This is absolutely sinful.
That's still going on in this state.
But I mean, well, the state did it for years, but finally we've gotten out of it, and our state.
The state did it?
Oh,
Some
that was
example,
our big deal. But I mean, now you're talking about private enterprise. And I think here, this young man, and yet in every place he worked, he could buy life insurance. He said, I don't want life insurance right now. He said, I want health insurance for my wife, and I'd like to raise a family. And he's knocking himself out at 3 full-time, half-time jobs a week. I think something should be done about that, so that these people could have the money and probably for the health care coverage, which is so important, because we pay more in the end, whether it's the state or the federal, if they don't get the health care now. We have a policy where for children, we will take care of their teeth, we'll pull them, but we won't fill them. So you end up with young people with a mouth, toothless. Great.
Teddy, I think there are two subjects there where there is some really good news about things that we can do for children right now without really major costs. The first one is the latchkey issue. I didn't understand what this was all about until all of a sudden, Hattie has always worked, and all of a sudden, my kids are in school, and I see a little bit of a problem. They're out of school at 2 or 3 in the afternoon, and it's not time for me to go home, and Hattie's trying a case down in the courthouse, and what are you doing with the kids? I mean, you've got a real problem, even when they're in school. I saw the solution one afternoon when I was down in Tucson at an elementary school, and the principal said to me, he said, I'd like you to come back here at 6 o'clock at night. And I said, well, would you mind telling me why? And he said, I think you'll see something interesting. Just do what I ask you. I know you're the governor, but, listen to me. Do what I'm asking. I came back at 6 o'clock, and there were parents arriving, factory workers, to pick up their kids who had remained on the school campus with just a couple of adults around to supervise them. And I remember the sun was kind of setting across the campus, and I asked a couple of the parents, I said, what did you do before this program was available? And one young guy just shook his head and he says, I can't tell you. I'm embarrassed to tell you because my kids were on the streets. My 3rd grader was on the streets with no supervision because there wasn't anything available. And I then turned to the principal and I said, hey, it's a fascinating program. Where did you discover it? And he said, well, we just figured, that these were public facilities, the taxpayers had paid for them, and that we ought to keep them open. And he said, the attorney for the school district told us that it was probably illegal, but I did it anyway. And I said to him, well, if you ever need a lawyer, I'll volunteer. And what that little event taught me was what I think all of us know, and that is that it would be very simple to pass in just a few simple incentives for schools to stay open from dawn to dusk. I mean, there are facilities. We paid for them, we built them, and we ought to be able to use them. And it doesn't require a lot of expense. You don't need certified teachers around at 6 in the morning, and you don't need them there in the afternoon. What you need is a few high school kids who are interested in child development under the supervision of 1 or 2 adults. It's not school time, it's play time in a safe, reasonable place. We gathered together the school establishment from all over Arizona, went out to the legislature and got the authority to run these programs. And I think all we need to do is change attitudes. That's a big one, and that it won't cost a lot of money. Now, the other thing I think we ought to talk about seriously is universal health care for children. We restructured the Medicaid program in my state. We turned it into a prepaid, capitated, fee per month, per person kind of program. Saved enough money to cover kids all the way up to the federal poverty line. And in the course of doing that, I discovered something that I suspect all of you know, and that is that health care for kids is a pretty good deal. I mean, it's basically preventive maintenance. And I think that's something we could step up to on the federal level by doing this, by expanding the Medicaid program to cover all children without exception, and then specify, and here's what I think makes it workable, simply to specify that when employers have health insurance programs for their employees, they must include the kids as well. Now, if you think about what that does, it keeps probably 80% of the children who have health care coverage in the existing programs, and then just wraps the Medicaid program around the other 10 or 20% who don't have it. What would it cost? It's a fair question. I don't think it's a big ticket item. I would guess, several $billion, and over a period of time, as we begin to get this deficit under control, it ought to be a priority, and we ought to start talking about it now.
Governor, everything that you've said, I agree with. I think everybody in this room agrees that these are issues that have to be tackled. They have to be dealt with. Each year that goes by over the last several years, it feels like we get farther and farther away from doing something about these problems. It seems that in the country right now, the people seem to be so ready to turn their heads and not deal with these issues. What kind of leadership would you provide in Washington to Congress? Because there's where the decisions are being made, and Congress seems to be as ready to turn their heads on these issues as anybody else. How would you change the thinking? Because what you're talking about, we haven't talked about at a national level for about 8 years.
But when you say you, it seems to me you really ought to be saying us, because ultimately, it's a two-way street. Leaders must say, here are the priorities, and the people who are involved and who care must stand up to say, okay, we're willing to fight for this. Now, that's a way, I guess, of being pretty candid, of saying the leaders haven't paid any attention to these issues, and the reason is the children don't vote. But on the other hand, the children's advocates have tended to be a little bit too genteel, to kind of, gather around and drink tea at seminars, listening to university professors, rather than organizing political action committees and getting this on the agenda, not just of Democrats, but of Republicans, and doing what all of the other interest groups have done so effectively in American life, which is create a little pressure and the fear of losing an election as a way of motivating people to get on with these issues. There are some encouraging signs in Congress, not nearly enough. Congressman Miller from California has been a very effective advocate, Senator Dodd from Connecticut, but got a long ways to go.
Is that what you mean by create a full-time advocate for children and youth programs in the governor's office for children? Or does that refer to the Youth Development Center?
No, the advocate that I created was basically a cabinet-level person whose job it was to coordinate the activities of state agencies and to bring together the different advocacy groups. She was tremendously effective, and she was fired by my predecessor just a few days after he took office.
I turn the subject a little bit to housing, which I haven't touched on this afternoon. And I know that's a major problem for the clients that we see, and I'm sure that the folks that most other folks come in contact with in this room. Even with the interest rates having dropped significantly over the past several months, there's not any more new affordable housing being developed. There's no federal funds in the pipe for new housing. I wonder if you have any new ideas or resurrecting old ideas.
Yeah, the housing issue has gotten steadily worse. I mean, the federal commitment to housing assistance has disappeared. You see it most poignantly, as I have in Phoenix, Arizona, by going out and going through the shelters for the homeless. In the old days, if there was a homeless shelter, usually built around a Salvation Army or a relief agency, you tended to see mostly the kind of stereotypes in people's mind, people who are mentally ill, drifters, that kind of thing. What's really heartbreaking is what you see now because you see young parents with small children in the midst of this kind of temporary makeshift housing. I mean, families. And you start asking questions as to why, and it's real simple. I mean, a single parent making a minimum wage of $6,800 a year is going to find precious little housing of any kind, anywhere. Now, again, the question becomes a budget question. In an era of limits and budget deficits, what do you do? I think one thing, going back to priorities, is that we have to have the guts to talk about how it is we assert those priorities. I think we're going to have to look at some of the urban programs, like the so-called UDAG program, the Community Development Block Grants, and begin asking whether it wouldn't be appropriate to say, sure, if we had enough money, we ought to be subsidizing downtown parking lots and all of those things. But isn't housing for homeless families a higher priority? And isn't there some way that we can begin to target those programs toward this higher priority and at the same time find at least some modest increases in the funding? They're hard choices, but I can't come here and honestly say to every inquiry, well, we'll just find more money. It's dishonest. We got to be a lot more tough-minded than that if we really believe in advocating for people who need the help.
That was great, but it's done away with the real housing for the poor. It has torn down every SRO in this city and in other cities you go to. They've made these beautiful city streets and these malls, and then in order to do that, every single room occupancy has been torn down, and there has been no replacement, and nobody wants to talk about it. And I think when you talk about affordable housing, you're not talking about the condos. I love affordable housing starting at $35,000, but that to me, I talk about the pits. The people that are under $10,000 who are living on 68. SROs are still a need in our community for them. And yet, here we've lost 800 in the past 6 years, 5 or 6 years. 800 single room occupancy. Where are those people? They went from one building to the other that was being torn down next, and now they're in the soup kitchen, the shelter, or it's in the parking garage or something like that. But that was done with community improvement grants. Make your city beautiful, make it pure, don't let's have the people. The poor you're always going to have with you. In spite of what everybody wants to say, the Lord has promised us the poor, and we're going to have it no matter what we think we're doing. And we're not providing for it.
Look, that's an important point. It's, that tradition began with urban renewal and continues today. Federal funds are in effect used directly to lessen the existence of and the supply of low-income housing.
They tear down the old houses and put up new ones and no one can afford it.
But again, we're lacking the leadership on the federal level. I think a lot of this could be accomplished. We were moving in the right direction for many of these issues for years. And then all of a sudden it's become unpopular to do things for your neighbor. The children have to be made a priority. They are our future. We're beginning to reap the benefits of our policy of neglect with children. We're leaving them in shelters and not being able to go to school. We're putting them in foster care inappropriately and leaving them there, and they're ending up in psychiatric facilities in their teens. And we're going to pay for this for the next 20 years unless we do something. It has to come from the federal level. There are people across the country ready, willing, and able to take part and help, but no single agency can do it alone without that firm leadership at the top.
The real heroes in American society are the foster parents who are such an integral part of the system of picking up kids who have been abandoned or hard to place. Maybe this is an appropriate place to wrap this up. I really appreciate the chance to visit, and I think your remarks are exactly right. It's not the responsibility just of state government. It's not the responsibility just of individuals or just of local governments. It's us. We're in it together. And I think, I sense everywhere that it's now time for a national policy that deals with early childhood, that lays out some priorities, and that says we can do better than just looking the other way, and that we do need federal leadership because ultimately the productivity and the coherence of this society, getting that high school dropout rate down, educating productive citizens is all tied up in the policies that relate to that first 6 or 7 years of life. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Our last stop on Road to the White House this week is the Old Town Days Parade in Londonderry, New Hampshire. The local high school band was there, and the people of Londonderry turned out in force for a small-town celebration, and also to catch a glimpse of their special guest for the day, Vice President George Bush. The Vice President marched in the parade along with his wife Barbara and New Hampshire Governor John Sununu. The gentleman with the sunglasses on are Secret Service agents. Our cameraman was sitting on the back of a flatbed truck driving in front of the Vice President, which is why the camera is a little shaky. We apologize for the jittery picture. We decided to show you this anyway because it isn't every day you get a chance to watch the Vice President in a small-town parade.
Don't believe the press. How are you? You're not smiling. Come on, guys. Make it feel good. What a day. This is like R&R. Hey, Kelly? Shorts. Almost wore those up. I didn't realize what you were doing. How are you? Did you run this morning? Really? How'd you do? Looking good.
Oh, does she? Does she really?
You have a race today? Got a number on it. Got one. How far? 3.1 miles. Good. 5, 6.
We talked to a few people on the parade route to get their reaction to having the vice president in their parade.
Have you ever seen the vice president before?
Not in person, no.
What was your reaction?
Well, I thought he looked an awful lot younger than his pictures.
Did he look an awful lot like a candidate for president?
Yes, I would think so.
What's the reaction been in the town? I mean, must have been for a long time people have been talking about this. What's been the reaction of the people you know in this town?
Well, it used to be a Republican town. I don't know if it still is totally Republican, but I think they're pretty much favorable toward him as president.
Any surprise to you that the vice president of the United States would come to a small town like Londonderry for a parade?
I'm not really surprised, but I'm pleased that he would.
Have you seen any other candidates come through here?
No, I haven't.
Have you met any other candidates?
No.
Thank you very much for your time. Appreciate it.
How you doing? Good.
Train's not getting started, but it all worked out. Make sure you were behind any horses.
Another runner. How'd you do?
What's your name? Where are you from?
Kathy Vecchione from Londonderry.
Your name?
Cindy Abbott, Londonderry.
Vice President of the United States was in town today. What was your reaction?
I was glad that he came. I wanted to see him.
Have you ever seen the Vice President before?
Just on TV.
Does he look any different on TV than he did in person?
Not really.
How about you? What was your reaction?
No, I think it was good, to come to a small town like this, and, it means a lot, I think, to the people that live here.
Did he look an awful lot like a candidate for president?
I think so, yeah.
Is this a common thing? Now, not everybody can get the vice president to come to a small town parade. Will you expect to see a lot of the presidential candidates come to things like this in your town?
I didn't think so. I come from Massachusetts originally, so, we get a lot of, big politicians, but I didn't think, it's the first time I ever saw one in a little town like this.
Have you ever seen any other candidates before?
No, just the governors, Sununu.
Is there much interest at this point, August, in the presidential campaigns? Any of your friends talking about it?
Oh, I think so, especially with everything that's happened, with the Contra affair and everything. I think there's a lot of interest in it right now.
Among your friends, are they talking presidential politics at all?
Yeah, a little. Still thinking about the summer, not really getting there yet, but they will be.
And we can't leave without asking what the little one's name is.
Kristen.
What was Kristen's reaction?
I don't know, I think she's a little hot.
Thanks for your time, appreciate it.
Thanks.
Let him out, he's all right. Just go on, just let him out. Hold up. stay out on the, yeah. Just stay out on this side.
Next week on Road to the White House, Pat Robertson holds a campaign rally at the Black Hawk Hotel in downtown Davenport, Iowa. We'll also broadcast a speech by Representative Richard Gephardt addressing the Midwestern Legislative Conference in Des Moines, Iowa. Road to the White House airs each Friday at 5 p.m. Eastern and Sunday evenings, 9:30 p.m. Eastern Time.
Stay on the line, please. Nobody gets hurt. Back behind the line, please.
Tonight are in the paper tomorrow.
How about a big Londonderry welcome for Vice President and Mrs. Bush. Chairman of the Londonderry Board of Selectmen.